The morning they took Earl Hadley away from his farm, he didn't cry. He stood at the kitchen door in his worn flannel shirt, hat in hand, and looked out at the land like a man memorizing a face he might never see again. His 2 sons had already loaded his chair and his Bible into the back of the car. They'd made up their minds 3 weeks ago, and nothing Earl said changed a thing. His granddaughter Maggie was the last one to say goodbye. She was 26, home from the city for the weekend, and she could see something in her grandfather's eyes that her father and uncle didn't seem to notice. It wasn't sadness, it was worry. He took her hand. His grip was still strong. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "don't let them tear down the barn." Then he let go, put his hat on, and walked to the car. Nobody asked him what he meant. Nobody thought to. But Maggie didn't forget. If you've ever had a grandparent whose wisdom was quietly overlooked by the people around them, subscribe and stay with us. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know which corner of the world is sharing this story today. Earl Hadley had farmed that same 160 acres in eastern Kansas for 53 years. He'd raised 2 boys on it, buried his wife beside the old oak at the edge of the south field, watched the price of wheat rise and fall more times than he could count. He was 81 years old, and until 8 months ago, he'd been doing most of his own work. Then came the fall, a bad one, down the porch steps, a fractured hip, a slow recovery, and 2 sons who'd been waiting, maybe longer than they'd admit, for a reason to make a change. They weren't bad men. They were just exhausted, running out of time, and terrified of getting that late-night emergency call. So they made a quick executive decision, signed the memory care paperwork, and tried to look forward before the guilt could catch up with them. 3 weeks after Earl left, Maggie came back to help sort through the property. The plan was simple: clear out the house, list the farm, move on. Maggie had grown up spending summers here. She knew every corner of that property: the creek that dried up in August, the cellar where her grandmother kept tomatoes, the hayloft where she used to read in the afternoons. She thought she knew the place completely, but she'd never paid much attention to the barn. Nobody had, really. It was older than the farmhouse, a massive timber frame structure built with square nails. Her grandfather had kept the heavy rolling doors locked with an old brass padlock for as long as she could remember. Whenever her dad asked about cleaning it out, Earl would just wave a hand and say it was nothing but junk and dead storage. Now, standing in the yard on a gray October morning, Maggie looked at that weathered gray wood and heard her grandfather's voice again. "Don't let them tear down the barn." Her father had already signed a contract with a salvage company. They were coming Friday morning to reclaim the old-growth pine beams. That gave her 4 days. She went looking for the key. She found 3 of them in the back of Earl's sock drawer, 2 small brass keys on a wire ring, and 1 long iron key that looked like it belonged to a different century altogether. None of them were labeled. She also found something tucked beneath the keys, a folded piece of paper, old and soft at the creases. She opened it carefully. It was a hand-drawn map of the farmstead layout, but it wasn't a standard land survey. There was a bold, hand-inked X inside the perimeter of the barn floor, and in the bottom corner, in her grandfather's rigid cursive, a single line: "Ask no one. Trust the ground." Maggie stood there for a long time. Then she grabbed a flashlight and headed out to the barn. The old iron key took some forcing, but the heavy tumbler finally threw with a loud, metallic clack. The massive door slid open on its rusted track, and the smell hit her first. Decades of dry earth, old cedar, and the faint, sweet scent of long-faded alfalfa. She stepped inside. It wasn't an empty movie set. This was a real Midwestern barn, cluttered with the remnants of 3 generations of farming. Rusted plowshares, stacks of scrap lumber, old tractor tires, and discarded workbenches lined the walls. But Maggie wasn't looking at the walls. She was looking at the floor. She walked to the center of the structure, kick-sweeping decades of loose straw and dirt away until her boots struck something solid and flat. Not dirt, weathered oak planks. Following the map's instructions, she cleared a wider circle, revealing a heavy iron ring flush with the floorboards. It was a hidden root cellar door, completely buried under old hay. She hauled the hatch open. Her flashlight beam cut through the dark below, reflecting off several large, zinc-lined grain bins and a row of heavy, wax-sealed vintage milk cans. She climbed down the wooden ladder. This wasn't just storage, it was a makeshift vault, completely dry and safe from rodents. Maggie broke the brittle wax seal on the nearest milk can and pulled off the lid. Inside, wrapped securely in heavy burlap, were ledger books. Dozens of them. Cloth-bound, their spines marked with years, 1931, 1932, 1933, going all the way through the 1950s. She opened one from 1947. The handwriting wasn't her grandfather's. It was older, more formal, the careful penmanship of someone who'd been taught to write like it mattered. At the top of each page was a name, Hadley Family Agricultural Cooperative, Mercer County, Kansas. She'd never heard of it. She turned to the zinc bins. Inside were more ledgers, alongside thick glass preserving jars. She unscrewed one and unrolled the thick parchment document inside. It wasn't a standard property title. It was a formal, multi-party agricultural trust deed. It covered 2,300 acres of contiguous land, and it was signed by 8 different families, dated 1938. Maggie sat down on the bottom rung of the ladder and stared at the signatures in the beam of her flashlight. Her family had only ever owned this single 160-acre homestead. Who were these other 7 families? And why had her grandfather kept this underground vault a secret for over half a century? She spent the rest of that afternoon down in the cellar, piece by piece uncovering a history that had been entirely erased from her family's dinner table stories. The ledger books detailed an incredible act of survival. During the darkest years of the Dust Bowl, when extreme drought, bank foreclosures, and crop failures were destroying entire towns across the Great Plains, these 8 neighboring families had refused to break. They hadn't merged their property titles permanently, which would have triggered immediate bank interventions. Instead, they had formed a private, legally bonded cooperative trust. They pooled their machinery, split their fuel costs, and combined their grain yields. Most importantly, by legally binding their farms into a shared cooperative entity, they created a unified front. If a bank tried to foreclose on one family's crop failure, the collective trust stepped in and covered the debt from the shared pool. It was a safety net woven from absolute trust, and it worked. While the surrounding counties saw massive land abandonments, the Hadley Cooperative kept every single one of those 8 families on their homesteads throughout the entire Depression. The ledgers held meticulous records. Every bushel of wheat, every gallon of tractor fuel, every vote cast by the families around a lantern. Maggie turned the pages, finding records of emergency meetings held right upstairs in this barn. She found handwritten notes from her great-grandfather, Thomas Hadley, who had engineered the layout of the trust. He wrote with the practical, no-nonsense grit of an engineer who had done the math. He didn't use emotional language. He just listed the hard data showing that they would either survive as a unit or go bankrupt one by one. Maggie felt a sudden, deep ache in her chest. She realized why Earl had kept everything so completely hidden. Years ago, when he had tried to talk about the old Depression days, his sons had brushed it off as Grandpa rambling about the old dirt years. They were focused on modern margins, chemical fertilizers, and scaling up. They didn't have time for history. So Earl stopped talking. He locked the cellar, hid the keys, and waited. He was waiting for someone who would actually care enough to look. The next morning, Maggie found the photograph. It was tucked inside the back cover of the final ledger, the one marked 1958, the year the cooperative finally dissolved as the post-war economy boomed and the families modernized. The black and white photo showed a large group of men, women, and children standing right outside the barn doors. Maybe 30 people, sun-baked and wearing their Sunday best, smiling proudly. On the back, in her great-grandfather's fading ink, were the names of every person in the picture, and below them, a single directive. "We came through together. Don't let them forget." Maggie ran her fingers over the names, then she dug deeper into the bin. Near the bottom, she found a yellowed letter addressed to Earl Hadley, dated 1987. It carried the official letterhead of the Mercer County Historical Society. The society was compiling a county history book and asked Earl if he possessed any artifacts from the rumored Hadley Co-op. They wanted him to donate whatever he had to the local museum. Tucked behind it was Earl's response, drafted in faint pencil on a piece of ledger paper. He had written a polite but firm refusal. Earl explained that these records didn't belong to the Hadley family alone. They belonged to all 8 families who bled for that land. He wrote that he wouldn't hand them over to a public museum until he could track down the descendants of the other 7 families to get their joint consent. But by 1987, many of those families had drifted to other states, and without modern tools, Earl couldn't locate them. So he kept his watch. He kept everything clean, safe, and together, waiting for the day the circle could be closed properly. He had been holding on to that quiet promise for 37 years. Thursday afternoon, Maggie's father called. "Maggie, just checking in," he said, his tone stressed. "The salvage crew is locked in for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. They're bringing the heavy drop beds to haul the timber. Make sure your car is cleared out of the drive." "Dad, you have to call them off," Maggie said flatly. There was a long beat of irritation on the line. "We've been over this. The sale contract requires the site to be cleared before closing. We don't have the money to pay a breach of contract fee, Maggie." "There is an underground root vault in this barn, Dad," she said, keeping her voice steady. "It contains the original 1938 cooperative trust charters for this entire township. If you bulldoze this barn without notifying the county clerk and the other families listed on these deeds, you are looking at a massive title clearance nightmare." That stopped him cold. The legal risk caught his attention far faster than sentimentality ever could. "What are you talking about?" he muttered. "I'm talking about our family history," she said. "Get Uncle Gary and get out here, tonight." By the time she hung up, Maggie was already working on her laptop. Using the explicit names listed on the back of the 1958 photograph, she started tracing descendants through regional property records, a Kansas genealogy database, and local community forums. Because several names were distinct to the county, she managed to locate 3 direct descendants who still lived within an hour's drive. She reached out to them immediately, laying out what she had found underneath the barn floorboards. Her father and uncle arrived early Friday morning, just as a cold autumn sun was breaking over the horizon. They didn't find an emotional granddaughter. They found a workspace. Maggie had brought the ledgers up to an old work table, lit by a shop light. Her father walked in, clearly defensive, ready to argue about real estate deadlines. But as he drew closer, Maggie pointed to the open ledger from 1934. "Look at the line item from November," she said quietly. Her father adjusted his glasses and looked down. It was his own grandfather's handwriting, detailing a zero-profit winter. Thomas Hadley had voluntarily diverted his family's remaining cash reserves to buy seed wheat for the Pratt family down the road, ensuring their neighbors wouldn't lose their homestead to the county tax assessor. Her father stared at the page. He reached out, his hand slightly trembling as he touched the faded blue ink. Uncle Gary stood over his shoulder, the typical gruffness completely leaving his face. For 20 minutes, the barn was completely silent, except for the sound of turning pages. "Dad never told us this," her father whispered, his voice cracking. He always said he had to keep the place together. I thought he was just being an obstinate old farmer who couldn't handle change." "He was protecting the story of what they did for each other," Maggie said. Just before noon, a truck pulled into the gravel driveway, then another. It wasn't the salvage crew. Maggie's dad had frantically pushed their arrival back by 48 hours to clear the title concerns. It was the neighbors. 2 of the local descendants Maggie had messaged had driven out immediately. One was an older man named Roy Pratt. He walked into the barn, looked at the ledgers, and then looked at the 1958 photograph. He pointed directly to a young woman standing in the front row, holding a newborn child. "That's my mother," Roy said, his voice thick with sudden emotion. "She passed away when I was just a boy. I don't possess a single picture of her from before the war." Maggie carefully removed the photo from its protective sleeve and placed it in his hands. Roy looked at it for a long time, his shoulders shaking slightly, before looking up at Maggie's dad. "Your father kept this safe all this time?" Her father looked around the old, weathered barn, seeing it clearly for the first time in his adult life. "Yeah," he said softly. He did. The sale of the homestead wasn't canceled. The reality of Earl's medical care bills meant the transaction had to proceed. But Maggie's father successfully negotiated a 60-day closing extension with the buyers. The State University's Agricultural History Department sent 2 archivists out to safely remove and document the vault's contents. They verified that the Hadley Cooperative records were an incredibly rare, fully intact blueprint of grassroots economic survival during the Great Depression. The documents were formally transferred to the state archives under a joint curatorship representing all 8 descendant families. The barn itself found an unexpected savior. Roy Pratt, who worked in structural preservation, helped file an emergency historic structure easement. Because the barn had served as the literal town hall for a documented historical cooperative, it qualified for a protective state heritage designation. When the young couple who bought the farm took possession of the property, the barn stayed exactly where it was. They didn't mind at all. They planned to use the historic structure as a central landmark for their new organic farm store. A few weeks later, on a crisp Saturday in December, Maggie drove out to the care facility. She brought a high-resolution, framed print of the 1958 cooperative photograph. Earl was sitting by the window, looking out at the cold gray afternoon. He looked small in the sterile room, but when Maggie walked in, his expression instantly sharpened. She sat down beside him and placed the frame in his lap. He looked at the faces of his youth, his rough thumb tracing the glass over his father's shoulders. "I found the cellar, Grandpa," Maggie said gently. "I opened the milk cans. We found the other families. Everyone knows what you did." Earl didn't speak for a long time. He just kept his eyes on the photograph, his breathing slowing down. "They have the records?" he finally asked, his voice low. "They're safe in the state archive," she told him. "And the barn is staying up. It's protected by law now." Earl Hadley closed his eyes and let out a long, quiet breath, his shoulders relaxing completely. "My dad told me the night before he passed. Earl, don't let this story wash away into the dirt." He looked back up at Maggie, a faint smile touching his eyes. "Took a long time," he whispered, "but we got it done." Maggie held his hand. "You kept the promise, Grandpa. Every single word of it." Earl Hadley passed away the following spring, on a quiet Tuesday morning in April. At the memorial service, the small country church was completely packed. Maggie didn't give a traditional, mournful eulogy. Instead, she stood up and simply read the meeting minutes from the winter of 1934, showing the community what real quiet courage looked like. After the service, an elderly woman from 2 counties over came up to Maggie, holding her hand tightly. "My family was one of the 8, she said. "We always knew we survived because of our neighbors, but we never knew the specifics. Thank you for giving us our history back." Today, the digital Hadley Cooperative collection is fully open to the public, frequently cited by historians studying American agricultural resilience. The State Archives dedication page features a simple inscription. These journals record more than bushels and debts. They document the exact moments a community chose to hold together when everything else was tearing apart. And if you ever find yourself driving down that quiet county road in eastern Kansas, you can still see the old Hadley barn standing tall against the horizon. It looks like an ordinary, weathered old building to the casual passerby. But for 8 families spread across the country, it remains a monument to a time when people looked at a crisis, reached out to each other, and refused to let go. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have a story of your own, about a grandparent, a family secret, a piece of history that almost got lost, tell us in the comments. We're listening.